Hey guys, welcome back to the Furidashi pod this week. My name is Lauren. I'm here with Nicholas. How are you doing today?
Pretty good. I love that sort of bobblehead thing you had going, like, "Hey guys."
Hey guys.
That's very nice.
Oh, thank
I'm
you.
doing great, Lauren. How about you?
Okay. I'm doing great. I'm really excited to talk about something that's near and dear to my heart, Persona 5
Oh, I thought
again.
I thought you were gonna say egg tarts.
Oh man, I love egg tarts. We just got out of a little
We
chat
were just
talking
talking
about
about
egg
egg tarts.
tarts. Yeah, there's like the Hokkaido egg tart, the Portuguese egg tart. Okay.
Yeah.
Anyway, also love egg tarts. Send me some egg
but
tarts.
but Persona 5, which is not a game about egg tarts.
It is not a game about egg tarts. Actually, I will note that Persona 5 has no egg tarts,
Oh,
despite being right taking place.
scandalous.
Scandalous. Um, Egg tarts are actually a pretty big thing in Tokyo. So
Yes, they are.
that is actually a really good point of contention. But however, for today's video game design discussion, not egg tart design discussion,
This is not the dim sum
um,
hour.
this is not the dim sum hour, but maybe it will be. In our spin-off series, just like Persona 5 spin-off series, Persona 5 Strikers.
Yeah.
A
Well,
way to
that was a
connect it.
segue.
Anyway, yeah, I really wanted to talk about Persona 5 Strikers, which was originally called Persona 5 Scramble in Japan, because we are talking about hardware and we're talking about controls and how consoles really influence game developers. And one of the fundamental, qualms people have about Persona 5 or for this Persona games in general as a franchise is that Atlus, its studio itself, has a contract with Sony. So you can only play Persona games, and the largest one, Persona 5 and Persona 5 Royale, were on the Sony PlayStation 4.
Yeah.
I think they also do upgrade to PlayStation 5. I'm honestly not sure. It might be so console driven you can only play them on the PlayStation 4. This is very exciting to me because Persona 5 Strikers is on the Nintendo Switch. And that's because the game developer of Persona 5 Strikers is most notably known for Dynasty Warriors. And I
Yep.
believe their current contract is with the Nintendo Switch. And so, since we just stopped talking about, or last week, we stopped the discussion on talking about Nintendo's design philosophy and getting that an official Nintendo seal of approval, I wanted to look at the game that not only has fundamentally have a relationship with the Sony PlayStation, but also looking at it from the context of how the gameplay itself is a huge departure from the Persona series. So, for those of you who don't know, I'm going to go into a little bit of a backstory for Persona 5 itself. Persona 5 is a game that is turn based. It is a turn based, basically, Japanese RPG, or just
Which
role
doesn't
playing
exist.
game, which doesn't exist. And it has, it's very story forward. It has a lot of dialogue. It's a 200-hour game. You can complete Persona 5 in under 100 hours for the entire main storyline.
Oh, only.
And only, usually it will take you about 147. That was my first playthrough. And I say this because it's a long, turn based, highly strategy game where, kind of like Final Fantasy Tactics, you need to kind of know your opponent's weaknesses and then use your own skills against them. It's also got a multi character class. But when you compare it to something like Dynasty Warriors is not about strategy and enemy weaknesses. It is primarily a button mashing game with multiple enemies on screen, a camera that you can turn around, and usually you're only playing one guy, maybe one or two, and they all have different weapons. So how do we translate that into Persona 5, which has, I think, 8 heroes or 8 characters?
Yeah.
Right? With all different affinities, different persona types. You can actually use multiple personas in Persona 5 Strikers. Also, I just realized I have the digital deluxe edition, and so I get to talk about this 3 days, 5 days, 3 days before it actually officially launches for those of you who got the base edition. I'm on version 1, not 1.02, not 1.0 whatever. I'm on version 1. I took a
Lauren, once
screenshot.
again, lording it all over you plebs with
Oh,
your
you
mere
plebs.
basic editions.
I will say that my wonderful Twitter follower, Duck Squiddy, he's great. Go give him all the love and buy his games. He actually tagged me in a photo of myself in the game. I play a character known as Futaba Sakura. You can see her on my back wall right here. And he tagged me and said that I was back. I am super excited to talk about this because, one, fundamentally, this game is a totally different gameplay than Persona 5. And yet, right, the fiction of the Persona 5 world and the art direction that for our video watchers out there, you saw.
Oh, you want me to bring it back? I'll bring it back.
Yeah, could you bring that back up really quickly for
Sure.
our video users?
Yeah.
But if you look up, you're listening on the podcast and you've ever played Persona 5, it's very stylistic. In Persona 5 Strikers, it has the same UI elements, the same tactical like screen, the same types of visual effects. And it's this type of art style, this art direction, the music direction that it really excites me because it's a different game, but it feels exactly the same. It feels like a Persona 5 title. And last week when we talked about playing Mario games and you're playing these Nintendo franchises and every game is so easy to kind of pick up and get into, that Persona 5, something that I would say is not as accessible or not as, say, easy to understand as the Mario games. Or rather, no, Nicholas, you put it better. Nintendo is making games for no true target audience.
Yeah, no demographic.
So for no demographic versus Persona 5 is incredibly for a demographic, which I guess is Persona players. Sure.
Weebs. I believe they're called weebs.
No, I refuse to use that terminology. I am not. I hate that terminology.
I'm also Well, I am weeb agnostic. I do not necessarily regard it as a negative term, although it is consistent. You're right. It is used as a negative, so I shouldn't. I apologize.
No, there is actually an article, I think, outside for people who don't know what weeb stands for. I'm actually not going to say what it stands for. Go look it up. There's this whole discourse about how people are taking on the term of weeb as a moniker for being like otaku. Like and taking that on
queering weebness. Is that what they're doing?
I somewhat, I guess. Okay. Yeah. But that's a weird phrase as well, Nicholas, I will say. However, all this to say is, side rant aside, there is a target demographic for Persona 5 players. I will call them Persona players in general. And then also, right, but for Mario, there really is no target demographic. Like, it's not for your kid. While some adults might say, oh, but it looks like it's for 5-year-olds. Yeah, but your 50-year-old grandma is going to have just as much fun. Right.
Yeah. So,
and most Super Smash players are in their 20s and 30s. So there you go.
In furtherance of that point, Nintendo does this consciously. Just look at any commercial for the Switch console, not for a Switch game, but for the console. And what do you see? You essentially see this like panoply of individuals, and not just a panoply of individuals, but you also see them in all sorts of different contexts. Like the underlying ethos, or sort of like you could say the design philosophy of the Switch, is that it can both be, in other words, how should I explain this? Nintendo historically has often always had like a portable game system in development at the same time that they've had a home console system. So like the Game Boy and the NES, the Game Boy Color and the Super NES, the Game Boy Advantage and the original Wii. Like so these things are all sort of in development. Oh, sorry, the N64, but they're in development at the same time. And so the Switch has in many ways kind of combined them. And you see a bunch of different kinds of people playing the Switch. You see a bunch of different contexts in which they play it. And so that is also a key component of like the not really having a demographic. It's like it's the game system that can be anything for anyone anywhere.
Right. And that's what's really kind of interesting about Persona 5 Strikers, or in Japanese it is Persona 5 Scramble. And it's because they had to.
For those of you who are listening, I have a Japanese version of the game up right now.
So Nicholas, I really wanted to ask you a kind of somewhat of a pointed question about this as well. If you can actually look at, if you can keep this window open, but go ahead and if you can look at the Persona 5 like Royale or just Persona 5 like the base version on the PlayStation. I really want him to look at the controls for the PlayStation and look at like a gameplay kind of screenshot for that. Because this is kind of this is the continuation of last week's discussion about how while maybe hardware technology hasn't kind of expanded, the software that game developers use has, as well as the controller, right? The PlayStation controller versus a Nintendo Switch controller are incredibly different. So Nicholas, I want you to look at the Persona 5 kind of base version.
Okay, so Royale is over here.
Yeah. And I'm really, oh man, it's always this screenshot, I think, because it's very early in the game and people don't want to spoil it because spoilers are very big.
Yeah.
And also Atlas had this weird streaming policy that they've thankfully made lax since COVID.
Japanese companies are often very queasy about like let's plays, and that's a whole another like discussion.
Yeah, we'll definitely go into that later. That'll be really interesting. So as a game developer, I do really look at controls and figure out what's the best kind of function for the players. When we look at a screenshot like in Persona 5, anything that has to do that's very important to your player, such as using an item or jumping or maybe attacking, right? It's going to be on those face buttons because you want it to be very quick. Anything that's going to has to take a tactical type of thought, you kind of put on the triggers. In first-person shooters, you know, you aim and you trigger to shoot, but then you can, and for PlayStation users, the trigger is R2 or L2. Yeah. But in shooters, when you want to shoot from the hip, you're not really thinking tactically, so you don't need to use two buttons, right, or two hands. So, Nicholas.
So one of this immediately reminds me of. It reminds me of two things kind of mashed up. So, by the way, everyone, I have never played a Persona game ever in my entire life.
Shame.
So this is literally, sorry.
No, it's okay.
There are games I have not played. I apologize. So what it immediately reminds me of is a mashup of both the like drop menu system in like classic JRPGs, which don't exist. So games like Final Fantasy or, you know, Dragon Quest, mashed up with sort of like the wheel-based system that you see in like Dragon Age games or even in BioWare games. It's sort of like the combination of those two things, because you still have a menu system, but the menu system is sort of like drawing your focus into a particular area, whereas the menu system in say like an older Final Fantasy game is kind of off in its own window in a Never land. Here you're like, it's interesting to me precisely because it's a menu that actually focuses your attention onto the action on screen rather than away from it.
Yeah, and I am going to tell everybody listening right now on the podcast that we really appreciate you listening to this podcast, and please stay with us. But this is a very visual discussion we're having.
Okay, I'll describe it real quick. So you've got your dude. Your dude is sort of, if you're thinking about the rule of thirds, it's in the first third. And he's in the bottom leftish, not quite corner, but near the corner. And around the dude, there's sort of this radial menu. One is order, change tactics, and that's on your L2. So we're talking about a PlayStation controller here. Gun, so this is for aiming. So this is the D-pad up. You have R2, which is on sort of the other side of where he's standing, because these menus are sort of radiating around him like it's almost like he's exploding the commands, which is kind of cool, you know, stylistically speaking. And then you have Persona, which I haven't played the game. I don't know what that means, which is on your triangle.
It does say use a skill, however. So Persona is like use a skill or ability.
Okay, so special skill. And then you have your square, which is item, circle, which is guard, and then X, which is attack. This is clearly an English version of this game, because in a Japanese version, the X and circle would be switched because of what X and circle mean in Japanese.
Yep, and that is very true.
But what's interesting about this, because the menu sort of radiates around him and is focused on him, and because of sort of the weird kind of like Dutch angle perspective that you have between him and the weird tongue thing that you're currently fighting, sort of in the middle distance. What's interesting is that sort of by being focused on, like if you're a new player, like I would be if I were actually playing this, what it does is it sort of, by looking at the menu, you're also looking through the perspective of the game. So the gameplay mechanic, the way the menu is structured and how you interact with it if you're a new player, is also then harmonizing with the visual perspective that the game wants you to have. Because one of the problems that you can have, like if you think about, you know, a classic JRPG like Final Fantasy VII, where the menu is completely like segregated from like the 3D cinematic gameplay, it's actually drawing your attention away from what is going on. And I know this because I was recently playing Final Fantasy VII in preparation for a class that I have tomorrow. I found it kind of distracting. I was like, this is a game I love, but actually this aspect of the mechanics is really annoying.
And so like you can see that in Persona 5, because it is that tactical turn-based game, we're in this kind of paused state where it's our turn, so we can kind of think, okay, do we want to change our tactics? do we want to pass the baton to someone else, right, on our team? Do we want to press triangle and use a persona, which is to basically use like a magic skill? Or I see that my health is a little low. Do I want to actually use an item? We actually also see something else on the user interface that says weak. So it says that this is Persona 5's way of telling you, hey, you have an ability that is weak right now to whatever this tongue monster is. For those of you who've played Persona 5, the tongue monster is, as you know, Kamoshida, which it is very early on in the game. And by early on, I mean it's in like the first 10 hours you realize he's the boss, which is very early on for a role-playing game.
Yeah, early. 10 hours.
10 hours in, guys. Yeah, that's also a lot of cutscenes. I think there's probably 4 or 5 hours of dialogue. So look at all of this. There's a ton of UI in here. This is the stylistic of an Atlus game. This was produced by Atlus, developed by Atlus. It's all in-house. It's for the Sony PlayStation. They have an amazing stylistic choice. Let's go over to Persona 5 Scramble, which was not done by Atlus. And let's look at their UI and kind of see how they've taken it, kind of reflected out. So this is Dynasty Warrior style. So if you've ever played any of the old Dynasty Warriors, or my favorite, Gundam Dynasty Warriors, I don't know, because swagging around in a mech with a sword is pretty great.
It is pretty great, actually.
Yeah, it's fantastic. We still have the party. So the party is on the left side of the screen, and it looks like you can switch to another party member with the D-pad left.
Yep.
This is the Nintendo Switch control, but you also kind of see the same on this one particularly. I wonder if this is actually for the PlayStation, because in the United States, Persona 5 Strikers is on the Nintendo Switch. But looking at L1 and R1 and R2, these are totally PlayStation controls. Right, so that is even more interesting to me, because is Persona 5 Scramble actually on the Sony PlayStation? But then for the Western release, they were like, no, the Nintendo gets it. So it's Persona 5 Strikers.
It's possible.
No, and that would actually explain my big point of contention, because what I wanted to show is that the Nintendo Switch version does not feel like it was made for the Nintendo Switch.
Yeah, I'm trying to find a non-Japanese screenshot. Most of these are of the Japanese.
I could share my screen, but I don't actually know how that's going to work.
Okay, well, here's what we'll do. We'll hit stop share. And then what I will do is I will promote you to assistant to the regional manager. And then you will be able to share your screen.
Assistant to the regional manager.
Yeah.
Can I please have some game? Because I am in the English. Wow, is there no gameplay here? Oh, there's gameplay like over here. But this is also in Japanese? Why are all the screenshots in Japanese?
Yeah, that's the problem I was having as well. I could only find ones that were in
Japanese. How do they know that I'm in Japanese?
Well, then why don't you talk about your experience playing it?
I'm gonna, so this is gonna be great. We're gonna go back into podcast mode here. I'm gonna find my Zoom window. There we go. All right, guys. So now back to my experience playing Persona 5 Strikers. Is the UI that we kind of saw a little bit in Japanese looked like it was for the PlayStation Sony console. That makes complete sense to me. Because the Nintendo Switch version, I cannot read any of the UI because it was not made for a tiny portable screen. This is not a game that was meant to be portable. This was not a game that was meant to be on the Nintendo controls on the sides of the screen. This was meant for a pro controller. It feels like a Persona game was ported to the Switch console because of how discongruous playing the game is, how small all the UI icons are. I could not read the tutorials because the screen was so small. And they have this dialogue box on the screen. And if you've ever played Dynasty Warriors, it's basically combo driven. And so you press 3 buttons in a sequence, one combo. You press 3 and then you end it with a right. If you've played like any of the Batman Arkham games, it's like, you know, you have your light finisher, your heavy finishers, your stuns, your whatever.
It's not quite button mashing. It's like button mashing / like rhythm gameplay.
It is. It is a little bit button smashing, but it is more rhythm game. And I'm going to actually say that with complete confidence, because unlike what I consider like Arkham, where it's a little bit like X, X, Y or something. or even like a fighting game like Tekken, where like you really have to hit them in a certain order, but you can also speed doesn't really matter.
Yeah.
In this, it is a little bit more animation driven, kind of like Devil May Cry. So if you hit X too fast, you will trigger the X combo instead of triggering, say, like an XY combo.
Yeah.
This is really important to Dynasty Warriors because since you are fighting, say, 50 enemies on screen at a time, right? It really is just about that area of effect attacks.
Yeah.
It was the original God of War, right? Did
Yeah.
this very well.
Another franchise that has gone in a very different direction.
Another franchise that has gone in a very different direction.
Yeah.
But I'm playing the Nintendo Switch, and because these combos are so important, they displayed them to me in kind of this hint tutorial style, which is a tutorial that doesn't take up too much screen space, but it's kind of takes up maybe about a third of your screen.
Yeah.
And that third of my screen, I could not read if it was Y or if it was X. And honestly, in some of them, because they had so many lines or so many buttons I needed to press,
Yeah.
I was like, is that Y or is it A? And Y and A look totally different. Now, for someone with astigmatism, they look a little bit of the same when I'm like staring at a really tiny screen and squinting my eyes.
Yeah.
But the fact that I had to do that made me think this game doesn't feel like it was for the Nintendo Switch.
No.
So I'm so, and I really don't think that it was. Now that I see that PlayStation screenshot, no way.
And now that you brought that up, it actually reminded me of another Switch game that I thought was going to be really great on the Switch, but then I actually found really annoying to play. And it is one of my favorite games of all time, and that's Katamari Damacy, which is an amazing game. But they did a remake, not a remake, but sort of a port of it called Katamari Reroll for the Switch. But it's fucking annoying to play on the Switch because the Switch is because unlike a PlayStation controller, the Switch's two analog sticks are not aligned with each other.
Yes.
One is down here and one is up here. But for those of you who have played Katamari before, you'll know that like that alignment is really important because that is the primary gameplay, is how you like maneuver the two analog sticks against each other. So not having them aligned, it's like I have this like muscle memory that is literally like probably, I don't know what, 20, I don't know how old the game is, at least 10, 15 years old, that says like, okay, no, I know exactly how to play this game. I've played it for hours, and it's tripping me up precisely because my thumbs are not aligned with each other. I mean, literally, like my wife and I got so annoyed with this that we specifically bought a controller for the Switch where the two analog sticks are aligned.
No, I think I
that
might have to do
frustrating.
that as well, just for playing other games.
Yeah.
And we looked last week on how the controls and how Nintendo has such a philosophy for excellence that it makes their games need to use the hardware that, over time, because of their laxing policies, and to be fair, have incredibly helped indie developers, right? Whose control schemes can match the Switch and who don't necessarily need like I don't want to say don't need, but like their games do something very differently that the controls work both on a controller and
because
on
the controls usually
the
for those
PC.
games are much more straightforward.
They're much more straightforward. Yeah, right. But like when I'm playing a Persona 5 game, and here's where it gets truly excellent, is that Persona 5 Strikers is the potential of a franchise. Like Persona 5's metafiction and thorough line, like we were talking about with Mario, like man, the world makes so much sense that Persona 5 Strikers is a canonical successor. It is a sequel, sort of, to Persona 5 Royale.
Yeah.
Or Persona 5. And even though it doesn't say necessarily reminisce or call back to the things that happened, say explicitly, because they don't want to spoil it, it does very much go, you just saved the world, obvious protagonist. Like, I can't believe you have to save it again, obvious protagonist. Like, that's not really a spoiler because if you never played it, you could say play Persona 5 Strikers on the Switch. And hint.
I'm completely impervious to your suggestions.
I know.
I have no idea what you're talking about.
But I do think that it's interesting because even though it has this, like, I really also want to talk about, okay, so like if Assassin's Creed has failed, right? Where do series like Persona 5, right, pick it up? I do have to say and argue that because it is on Nintendo Switch and I guess in the West, it does just feel completely out of place. I can't view it on the screen. I honestly, it's too dark. The UI is
Because
too small.
it relates to a point that we made last time, which is that when Nintendo is at its best is when sort of their goofy hardware is matched by their goofy software.
Mhm.
Like when the two things are working together and sort of like harmonizing with one another, then it produces really interesting gameplay. The problem is when you port a game, you take someone else's conception of hardware and you try to mush your hardware into it. Now, that can work with, say, like, porting between, say, like PC and console or console and PC, because PC is relatively flexible in terms of like how things, keybinds work and all that. But the hardware for a console like the Switch is very inflexible. Like you don't have a whole lot of options in terms of like how to remap things, and also like as I was saying earlier, just like the feel of the controls in your hand. And so then you get yourself to this point where like, okay, so if we're trying to answer the question, like what could, like let's say Ubisoft came to us, like was like, hey, we want to introduce you to somebody. This is our hapless level designer. We have just promoted them to senior vice president of figure shit out, and we have $1 billion to hire you guys as consultants. And so you and I come on, and we're like, okay, we've been talking shit on the internet. Now we actually have to like make this work. We can't just criticize. We actually have to.
Hey,
do
look, I
something
am a
productive.
professional game developer. Okay, I have like a PhD in like.
I'm
making
talking
shit
about
happen.
myself. I'm not talking about you. I'm pretty much talking about
Okay,
me. So,
that's true.
so if we're thinking about, okay, well, then what was the thing that Nintendo did correctly? It wasn't actually hardware. It wasn't software. It was the harmonization. So if you have a storied franchise like Assassin's Creed that has been doing the same thing over and over and over again with slight variations, and then all of a sudden you start trying to do something else entirely, how do you justify that? Well, you actually use the game itself to explain that. So, we spoiled the fact that Desmond dies, and you're now onto like a different set of people. But the thing is, they could have used that moment. Like you could have essentially said like the old way of doing Assassin's Creed died with Desmond, but now that we have this new person who has to like deal with a sort of like genetic memory issue as well, but approaches it differently, you can then have the gameplay also approach it differently, which is we're talking about fucking ludonarrative harmony.
Okay. Yes. No, I know. And then ludonarrative harmony is my thing. That is what my master's was in. Like
Yeah.
that is what I know. But so it's interesting. So they could have done that. However, if you know and you have been playing all the Assassin's Creed games since the first Xbox or whatever you ever got,
Yeah.
they did do that. So in Assassin's Creed
Yeah.
4, Black Flag, they changed the camera perspective. It wasn't a third person game. It was a first person game.
Yeah.
And yeah, that old way died with Desmond because they said that Abstergo now had all of the ways of doing that, like they always had, right? But now you were literally just employee number 27. Your in-game trophies that you achieved by playing the game appeared on the shelf behind you, just like this for me. And it was like, surprise, you see how you did that with Edward? Like, good job, employee number 27.
Yeah.
We're so glad that you can access Desmond's memories now that he's dead. Like literally that was just like, thanks for being able to do this. You'd get called into the boss's office and he was like, wow, you're like actually making progress. No one else is making progress. You're a good employee.
Yes.
Very strange. And then you could hack into other people's computers, but it kind of died there. Like Assassin's Creed 4 was the last step franchise of trying to deal with it. But the way they answered that question to try to say, hey, Assassin's Creed is going to be different now, it's just going to be, say, Abstergo employees, was basically saying, let's change it to a first person's perspective because you're the Abstergo employee. And then let's take it from there.
Yeah,
but then they changed it again.
Yeah.
That's the thing.
And I think part of the problem is because you were right to point out that they did it and that it worked. But I would argue that I think they probably didn't recognize what was happening. Because if they had recognized what was happening, they would have continued to do that instead of flailing, which is what the subsequent like Assassin's Creed games kind of did. Not necessarily in a bad way, because again, as the point that we made before, which is that like the fundamental gameplay, like how it feels when you're like, killing mobs, like that's all fine. But we're talking about this sort of like lingering like background, like, is this right? Like, does this feel right?
Yeah.
Like
And so
that is
like
what gets lost.
so look at Assassin's Creed 4 and then Assassin's Creed Unity, no longer 5,
Yeah.
okay? Just in case any of you were wondering the timeline of Assassin's Creed here. Unity came after um, Assassin's Creed 4.
Yeah.
What's really important about these two titles is that halfway through the development of Assassin's Creed 4 and or at the towards the end of development when maybe I think maybe a writer left or something happened. I'm going to say maybe because I am actually not recounting an article that I read. I am now completely doing supposition here.
Yeah.
Somewhere in the middle of Assassin's Creed 4 Black Flag, all of the meta that they had planned, this first person perspective, being able to hack into machines, completely got outwritten. They just were not able to do it. And you can tell because at the end of the game, if you interact and do everything that you're supposed to in this first person perspective, and you're still dealing with the effects from Assassin's Creed 3, nothing happens. You get no reward. It doesn't change the Assassin's Creed game inside of Assassin's Creed, which the game being playing a pirate assassin, which is really fun. Unlike it had in every previous title. And that's honestly just because I think that they run out of time and they ran out of development and they ran out of features. And at the end of the day, they had to make a choice as developers. And it was, are you making a meta narrative game where we need to have these both equal, or are you going to make the Assassin's Creed game that is the majority of gameplay?
Yeah.
And I think at the end of the day, they went, well, our writer left for this. Maybe our gameplay developer left it. This is a first person game and we shouldn't have done first person and third person. So we already made a mistake there.
Yeah.
We're just going to cut the rest of it and we're going to focus on Black Flag. And they did. Then you see this in Assassin's Creed Unity, where the meta continued from Black Flag, but they said, hey, random hapless level. It was really hapless player, to be honest. They were like, thanks for playing this game. We have multiplayer. Did you know? You can help out other players that call you from the Animus because they're your employees, just like you, employee. And they realized that their meta narrative for like making the person an employee, generic employee, was pretty bad. But that's when I say you can also see the writer left, because I think that writers at a time can kind of like, our brains think a little bit more interconnectively. So we could go, oh, you are still the same employee. Let's fictionize it. Let's just say your name is James now, and like just throw it on there.
Well, yeah.
But then after Unity, they honestly just threw it out because they went to the multi-studio model.
Yeah.
And then they were like, goodbye.
Well, then that's where sort of the like feeling of it being all over the place kind of originates. Well, not originates, but sort of becomes the issue that it has become, precisely because now you have like completely separate studios like doing their own thing, and their own thing is often good, but the question is like, are they contributing to a larger whole? And I think that's really what you were getting at.
Yes.
Whereas the example of like Persona 5, you do have like a fundamentally different studio working on, quote, the same thing. But the reason why it harmonizes, at least I think, let me posit a theory and you can tell me if I'm correct. The reason why it harmonizes is because the game is more than just the story, it's more than just the gameplay, but you also have like a certain aesthetic sense, you have a certain like attitude, you have voice acting, like all of those elements. The problem is that like with Assassin's Creed, those other aesthetic elements can't necessarily remain the same, because Assassin's Creed sort of bills itself as, well, the gameplay is going to be like, there's going to be a different kind of story each time under this frame. Whereas what Persona can do would be like, well, actually, we can kind of tell more or less the same sort of story again, the same kind of goofy thing, but we'll just do it with different particulars. And so it feels like the same kind of game because those other aesthetic qualities have remained the same, even if the gameplay mechanics have fundamentally changed. What do you think about that?
Yeah, I know. I think that that's where you kind of hit on it, is that Persona as a universe, and Persona 5 particularly, has this very strong, I don't want to be like meta narrative, but it is. It's a very strong universe. It's a very strong world with those deep characters. They've got strong narrative qualities.
Yeah.
and they are contributing to a larger whole. I wanted to look up the actual developers because we have pointed at them so often
Yeah, we might want to actually give them
here.
credit.
And I wanted to give them credit. And Persona 5 Strikers is actually Omega Force and
Okay.
P Studio. P Studio being the Persona 5, like Persona Studio.
Yeah.
Omega Force is it's the Dynasty Warrior Studio. That's Persona 5 Strikers. And I think what's interesting here is that the Omega Force.
Do not bring the Omega Force into this. I don't want those weirdos coming after us.
Well, because it's the Persona 5 multiverse is what I was trying to say, is that the Persona 5 multiverse is such an amazing kind of conglomeration of developers now that they really are contributing to a Persona 5 narrative. It's that huge thoroughfare.
And because they're on the same page, because they have the same perspective that the game has, or have the same perspective about the game, in the same way that, like, you know, to go back to our Nintendo example, like a bunch of different designers, and Nintendo also has like a decentralized like system where they have separate like teams and studios that don't necessarily interact with each other, but because they've all been inculcated with the same basic philosophy and the same basic worldview, they can produce the same kind of thing without having to be like explicitly micromanaged.
Right? Yeah. And I think what's interesting is that we also talked about how Assassin's Creed always kind of has this new protagonist each time. We were looking at Mario, right, or Legend of Zelda, and they all have like kind of the same protagonist. But with Persona 5, and then we also mentioned that Final Fantasy 7 or Final Fantasy games in general tends to have these spin-offs where they put all of their characters into one kind of universe, and that's been most notably known by, say, Kingdom Hearts, which would be another franchise discussion for a later date.
Yeah, because we're kind of running out of time, and since we've come to finally a point, which we always do, I want to thank everyone for listening to or watching this week's episode. You can find us on Twitter at Furidashi Pod. You can find us on YouTube, just Furidashi Podcast. There's a search bar. You guys know how to use it. Otherwise, thank you, Lauren, for talking again with me this week. I always enjoy it. And for those of you out there listening or watching, please stay safe in these trying times. Stay healthy. And as I tell
play Persona 5.